So I have what I hope is a really encouraging video for you all today. I was thinking about the template that we have out there, and this is not just my work. This is the work of so many people who have been engaged and involved, people who email me, people who are in the comments section, who ask questions, who provide verses, who think about these things too, and then contribute to the discussion. That this isn't something that I've come up with all by myself. Okay, this is a group effort, and I'm so appreciative for all of you who have engaged with me in this process. What we have basically is an order of events that is a template. And because it's a template, the order of events stays the same, but the dates for things may change depending on what years the template is covering. So if we have a return of Christ in 2027 on the Day of Atonement, then we would fill in all the feast days working backward from that day. If Christ's return is in 2028, then we would use the Day of Atonement in 2028, work backward, find the Day of the Abomination of Desolation, which is 1,260 days before the Day of Atonement, and then we just work the rest of the stuff just the way we do. So we just plug in new dates. So it's a template, and we're working it from what we know is a known feast day that Christ will return on the Day of Atonement in the year of Jubilee in some year. Over the past few months have been examining the evidence that we're looking at here for, when Christ would return. All of a sudden, it starts becoming more clear to me that, we can't keep pushing the date out, for a return past 2028. And 2027 for the second coming of Christ is looking really, really, really good. And so, I'm not predicting anything. I'm just looking at evidence that I'm seeing and going, okay, according to what I'm seeing out there, this seems to be the one. All right. So, and whether I'm right or wrong, time will tell. But I'm thinking about this stuff, and I'm going, there's two things that need to happen that I have on my template that I'm not sure that are correct. So I'm asking the Lord this morning, I'm going, I know we need to fine tune something here, and I'm not sure exactly what, and I don't really know where to go. Could you help me, please? And the Lord is so gracious. I just love how He works in my life. It's just so encouraging. So there's two basic questions that we need to look at. Again, we just need to keep fine tuning, re-examining what we're looking at here. And this is a very healthy thing to do, by the way. If somebody has something that is so set in stone that you can't go back and reevaluate, well, you got a problem. Spirit-led people have a kind of a flexibility to them. There's a kind of a reasonableness that you can look at things and re-examine what you've believed before and see if there's more evidence. And whenever you come up with more information, you need to re-examine what you were looking at before. The more information you have, the better able you are to come to a good conclusion or have a good outcome. So there were two questions that I had this morning concerning this timeline template that I have. And one is there a pattern that's associated with the ark being brought into the temple? Because the two witnesses are going to erect a version of the tabernacle of David that's going to be a reflection of what the heavenly temple is that we see in the book of Revelation. So this pattern I talked about in a video I did not too long ago, so I'll leave a link to that so you can watch that. But in my template, I have the erection of the tabernacle of David, the end-time tabernacle, with the ark in it as being on the Day of Atonement. And I arrived at that because I know that the two witnesses are going to be the people assigned to do that, to set up that end-time temple. And I know that the two witnesses are the two olive trees and the two lampstands that stand beside the Lord of all the earth, and that sort of takes you back to the transfiguration of Christ that happened on the Day of Atonement. But is that the right day to assign the bringing of the ark into a newly built temple tabernacle? And I had an aha moment, and I went, no, that's not the right day. You big silly, it's not the right day. So we'll look at the correct day for that. And the second one concerns the war in Israel. You have to have the travail of the woman before the baby is born. Now, there's a travail that's spoken of in Isaiah 66 that has to do with the nation of Israel, that without travail, the nation is born. That's not the Revelation 12 travail. Okay, in Revelation 12, we know that the woman is in travail, and then the child is born. That there has to be a war before you can have the birth of the male child. And you have to have the birth of the male child before you can have the catching away of the male child. There's always 8 days associated with the male child. There's 8 days associated with the Feast of Tabernacles, 7 days, and then that mysterious 8th day right afterward. So I'm thinking about this, and I'm thinking about, will the war in Israel take place on a feast day? And I have it happening on a feast day, potentially over the Feast of Trumpets, potentially over the Day of Atonement. And as I'm thinking about this, I'm going, no, wait a minute. No, you can't attach a feast day to when the war will start. Okay, so let's look at some passages for both of those things. And I think what we're going to find is that everything is actually pointing to tabernacles this year. No Feast of Trumpets thing, no Day of Atonement thing. The evidence is pointing to major things happening over the Feast of Tabernacles, including the bringing of the ark into a newly established temple, the sealing of the 144,000, and the birth of the male child, which will have happened after a war in Israel. So if Jesus returns in 2027 and our rapture is in 2023, that means that next week there has to be a war. There has to be a war in Israel, but we don't know what day. If there is no war in Israel next week, then we go another year. Okay, so that's how this goes. It's a template, and it's associated with feast days. It has to be associated with feast days because we know Jesus is going to return on the Day of Atonement in some year. That's a known thing. Okay, so we know the feast days are in play, and they will actually begin when Christ descends to the earth to change us. If you're interested in learning more about that, you can look at my video on Revelation chapter 10. I think you'll be encouraged. But let's talk about the return of the ark to the temple. So we know that the iteration of the coming temple is not what people say. It's not going to be on Mount Moriah. It's going to be on Mount Zion. It's going to reflect the status of the heavenly temple at that time. So it's just a tent. It's not a permanent building. There's no sacrifices associated with it. We don't need a red heifer. All the things that people traditionally associate with a rebuilt tribulation temple have nothing to do with what is the actual temple that's coming. Okay, so watch that video. I think you'll be encouraged. It's very scriptural, okay, contrary to what a lot of the information is that's out there right now about red heifers and ashes and Dome of the Rock and all of that. We know that the Bible is going to give us patterns, prophetic patterns about how things are going to play out during the end times. And that's what we're going to examine today and look at a couple of prophetic patterns that I missed. So, and it's interesting. You look at this stuff and then you go, duh, how did I miss that? Well, you look at a lot of things and you're trying to figure out a lot of things. You have to go over it and over it and over it. It's like when you're doing a painting or anything. You have to continually add layers, take things out, revisit, redo it. I mean, it's a work. It's a work of art. It takes time to be able to fine tune all the little details and put in every eyelash and all of that. So we're just fine tuning. So Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:11 that the things that happened to the children of Israel in the past are examples. They're examples for us in terms of their behavior. And it's more than just the children of Israel who were examples. The prophetic patterns, especially the types and shadows that are in the feasts of the Lord, that are in the tabernacle of Moses, that are in the temple of Solomon, that are in the pattern of the firstborn, a bunch of these rules and regulations and laws and things that were in the Old Testament. These are prophetic patterns for us to look at. Now, let's take a look at the new temple that's coming along with the ark. The ark will be there. So the glory of God in Christ is going to return during the end times. And Christ is going to appear like on the earth before his visible glorious return at the end of the reign of the beast. And the glory of God returning is shown to us in Revelation chapter 7, and it follows the pattern of the Old Testament example in Ezekiel chapter 43. I'm going to read verses 1 through 5. The glory of God departed from the temple in the Old Testament, and Ezekiel describes the glory of God returning to the temple, to a place where the temple is. And then Revelation 7 is using this passage in Ezekiel to describe Christ's coming glory to a future temple. So let's take a look at this. Ezekiel 43, 1 through 5. Then the man brought me back to the gate that faces east, and I saw the glory of the God of Israel coming from the east. Remember, the glory of God had departed to the east, to the Mount of Olives, went up from the Mount of Olives, and now we see the glory of God returning to the Mount of Olives and coming from the east. And his voice was like the roar of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. And the vision I saw was like the vision I had seen when he came to destroy the city, and like the visions that I had by the river Kibar. And I fell face down, and the glory of the Lord entered the temple through the gate facing east. And then the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. This is the Old Testament prophetic pattern for what we see in Revelation 7:2. And then we're going to look at another prophetic pattern. Then I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God. And of course, this is Christ. He is the only one who carries the authority of God. And he cried out with a loud voice to the four angels to whom it was granted to harm the earth and the sea. It basically says, don't harm anything until we've sealed the servants of our God on their forehead. But the point here is that the glory of God, this glorious angel, is Christ. He's not an angel, but he is a messenger from God. And he is carrying all of God's authority in that seal. And he's coming from the east. So there is a feast day that's associated with the consecration of the temple and the bringing of an ark into the temple. And it's very clear in Scripture what feast day that is. That's the Feast of Tabernacles. So we're going to take a look at 2 Chronicles chapter 5, and really the whole chapter. I suggest that you read that. I'm not going to read it all, but this has to do with when Solomon finished his temple and they were going to bring the ark into the temple. Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes and the leaders of the fathers' houses of the people of Israel in Jerusalem to bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is Zion. And all of Israel assembled before the king at the feast that is in the 7th month. And that feast is the Feast of Tabernacles. And down to verse 11. And when the priests came out of the holy place, for all the priests who were present had consecrated themselves without regard to their divisions, and all the Levitical singers, Asaph and Heman and Jeduthun and their sons and kinsmen, arrayed in fine linen, with cymbals, harps, and lyres, stood east of the altar with 120 priests who were trumpeters, And it was the duty of the trumpeters and singers to make themselves heard in unison in praise and thanksgiving to the Lord. And when the song was raised with trumpets and cymbals and other musical instruments in praise to the Lord, and then this is what they sang, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. The house of the Lord, was filled with a cloud, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of God. So this is the pattern for the dedication of the temple. It's on the Feast of Tabernacles, and the glory of God fills the temple. All right, let's take a look at the birth of the child. I can't believe I didn't see this earlier, but oh well, that's how it goes. Revelation 12 describes the birth of the male child. And we know that the woman is going to be in travail, and then the child will be born. Okay, and then the dragon will try to devour the child, and then the child will be caught up. This is actually a rapture passage for that group of 24 elders who are going to rule and reign. Okay, and that this is the child who's going to rule and reign with Christ. In the Old Testament, travail is used to symbolize an invasion or war. Okay, and this is super common. There's many passages that allude to this, that talk about travail and a war. So here's the question. When do women go into labor? Well, actually, nobody knows. Okay, nobody knows. Labor happens suddenly. It's unpredictable. It's usually at an inconvenient time. It can be in the middle of the night. It can be, when you're at a party or wherever. It can happen. It can start anytime, anywhere. But the predictable thing is that it results in the birth of a child. So 2 Thessalonians 5:3 talks about this. While people are saying peace and security, destruction will come upon them suddenly, like labor pains on a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. So this word suddenly is the one I want to look at. I don't want to look at the peace and safety stuff because that is not pertinent to this particular video. This word suddenly is only used 2 times in the New Testament. And I'm not going to pronounce it because I know I'm not going to be able to say it correctly, but it just means unexpected or sudden. And the only other place that this is used is in Luke 21:34. But watch yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and the cares of this life, and that day come upon you suddenly like a trap. For it will come upon all who dwell on the face of the whole earth. But stay awake at all times, praying that you may have the strength to escape all these things that are going to take place and to stand before the Son of Man. Luke 21:34. So this word suddenly, it comes suddenly. So labor comes suddenly, which means it's unpredictable, which means we can't associate it with a feast day. We can associate the birth of a child with the feast day. That's the Feast of Tabernacles. And there's a lot of examples of this 7-day with an 8th day pattern in Scripture that apply to the birth of a child, to priests entering into service, to all lepers being cleansed, so on and so forth. I've done a whole video on this before. Labor is terrifying and it's painful. It's not pleasant. But here's what Jesus said about labor and the birth of a child in John 16:20-22. Truly, truly, I tell you, you will weep and wail while the world rejoices. You will grieve, but your grief will be turned to joy. This has to do with Jesus talking to his disciples in the upper room about the grief that they're going to have when Jesus dies, but then when he rises from the dead, they'll have joy. Verse 21, a woman has pain in childbirth because her time has come. And this is the comparison, okay? But when she brings forth her child, she forgets her anguish because of her joy that a child has been born into the world. So also you will have sorrow now, but I will see you again, and your hearts will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy. So the war in Israel is unpredictable. We don't know when that's going to happen. And someone had left me a comment that talked about how the Israelite women were vigorous and they had short labors so that the midwives, okay, this is talking at the time of Exodus, so that the midwives, it was too late for them to be called because it happened quickly. And this is very interesting. It may be a very, very, very fast war. And I'm thinking it's the Ezekiel 38 war, but it could be something else too. And the war is unpredictable. We don't know when that's going to happen, but it does happen before the birth of a child. So the man-child will be born the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles, and then brought into God's presence on the 8th day. This is the pattern, the prophetic pattern that we're working off of. But the war itself is not predictable. It's compared to childbirth, which happens suddenly and unexpectedly. So the joy of the Feast of Tabernacles is connected with the birth of the child after a time of stress and labor. It's connected with the bringing of the ark into a temple or the tabernacle, and it's connected with the return of the glory of God to the earth. So, to summarize, we don't know when the war in Israel will begin, but it will begin suddenly prior to the Feast of Tabernacles. And not necessarily this year, it could be next year too, right? And the second thing we know is that the glory of God, who is Christ, will enter that newly erected temple over the Feast of Tabernacles. All right, so that's encouraging, I hope, for you, and you can just make those little changes in your timeline if you have to sort of pencil something out, and we may have to tweak a couple of other things as well. And if we go past this Feast of Tabernacles, we just keep marching on, and the Lord will show us something new, something different, and He's always got something new, and if we're flexible and willing to learn, we'll always be in a growth mode and all of this stuff. So I hope you've enjoyed the video. Leave a comment in the comment section and share the video if you feel led. We'll see you on another video. Till then, have a blessed day.